Unless you plan on sitting up there to speak. Right. Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't on. I think we mentioned this last week, or 2 weeks ago. The last part of chapter 39, in verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him, showed him kindness, granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And then when you transition into chapter 40, sometime later, and so obviously we don't know the sometime later in terms of weeks, months, or years. So Joseph was in prison all this time, and yet being the manager or being in charge of a number of different things. And I don't know if this is a curiosity for you or not, but I wonder what it looked like that the Lord was with him. I mean, we're told that, but, and in fact, we're told that, 5 different times throughout this narrative, that the Lord was with him, the Lord blessed him, the Lord gave him favor, either with Potiphar or now in the prison, and what that looked like. What does that look like for us, for God to give us favor and to bless us? And are we even open to noticing that even in challenging moments that God is blessing us and giving us his favor? Because we need to remember in this narrative that where is Joseph at this time? You know, he's not only in Egypt being sold, and then he was in Potiphar's house. Now he's in prison for his integrity. And yet in these moments, it continues to tell us the Lord is with him or the Lord has favor on him. So how do we know, how do we notice, how can we see with perceptive eyes that the Lord has favor on us even when things aren't, going our way? How do we do that? How do we make sure that that's happening for us, do you think? Right? And who knows if Joseph did or not? It just tells us that he was there. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Look for the negative. Yeah, we're kind of designed that way in terms of our current culture. I think I told this story a couple of months ago. One of the things my grandson enjoyed doing and still does is on our back porch, we would either get some hard-boiled eggs or even regular eggs, and he loved to go out in the back porch and he would either throw them on the ground or stomp on them. He just enjoys doing that. And he threw one on the ground, and for whatever reason it didn't, crack. And so Terry tells me to go out in the backyard and get the egg. And so when I hear egg, and I'm a very mentally visual person, and so I see egg and I see a white oval, object. So I go out there looking, there's no egg out here. Yeah, there is. Tay threw it, and I need you to go get it because he wants to throw it again. There's no egg. Well, it was a brown egg. I wasn't looking for a brown egg. I was looking for a white egg, and there was no white egg out there. So as we're dealing with life, if we're not looking for God to bless us, or maybe we're looking for it, but we are looking for it within a certain context. I want things to go well, and I want this to happen and that to happen. When that doesn't happen, God's not blessing me. God's favor is not with me. And here with Joseph in these moments, he's in these places that aren't his home, aren't with his family, and yet God is still giving him favor in these situations. And again, I don't know if there's any way for us to prove or show that he noticed that. The narrative is simply telling us that that's the case. So it tells us that he had success in whatever he did. And then when you flip over to chapter 40, you now have, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king offended their master, the king of Egypt. And so Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into prison. And where did they end up in prison? Very same place Joseph was, where Joseph was confined. So the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So now you have these two men who are going to have these two dreams, not in the same general location, but in the same actual confinement that Joseph is in. And after they had been in custody for some time, it's interesting here, not only sometime later, verse 1, but also they were in custody for some time. Each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. And so, as Joseph is in this place, all of this is being designed and planned by God to ultimately get Joseph in front of Pharaoh. But when is that going to happen? It's going to take time. And this has been one of those things that we talk about often, is that whenever we pray for something, pray for change, pray for a shift, pray for lanes to be changed, something to be altered, our current composition in this current Western culture makes it very difficult for us. You know, I want change literally to happen tomorrow. I want the answer tomorrow, if not today. And in this situation with Joseph, even as these men are given to him, the dreams don't come in a week or a month or 6 months. It's a 2-year process before these dreams happen. Or I say 2 years, we're not told that. But it is time before these dreams happen. So each of the men have these 2 dreams, and when Joseph came to them, he saw that they were dejected. And so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you guys look so sad today, or look so dejected, look so down?" And I couldn't find the Hebrew word, but as I was reading this, I was thinking about Genesis 3 with Cain and Abel, that as they both gave their offerings to God, that God spoke to Cain and asked him, "Why are you so dejected? Why are you so sad?" And of course, situations are entirely different, but I found it interesting, this idea of looking sad or looking, dejected. And the other thing I find interesting here, before we even get to the dreams, is, and I've just simply never noticed this before, all the things that have happened to Joseph up to this point, where he could be agitated, frustrated, have a bitter attitude. And yet as he comes, as he sees these 2 men in prison, and of course he's in charge of everything, as he sees these 2 men, what is his concern? He's wondering about them. He notices that they look dejected. He notices that they look sad. And the reason I bring that up is, oftentimes as we get in situations where it's not going our way, we don't like it, we're upset about our current environment in front of us. How oftentimes does our attitude then become about other people? And how can I serve? How can I love? How can I show mercy? Whatever the case may be. So we get very frustrated about where we are and what's not going our way. We kind of forget to see other people. And yet Joseph here, when he sees these 2 men, and who knows how much they talked, who knows if they, gained a friendship, a relationship, whatever you call it. But when we look at these moments like this, Joseph is thinking about other people. So he asked them, "Why are you so sad?" So when we consider these two men, why would these dreams make them sad or dejected, do you think? Because we already know what the dreams were. Hey, good to see you, man. Good to see you. Yeah.
I have woken up from dreams where I couldn't express the contents of the dream completely, and it left me with a feeling of foreboding.
Okay.
Something that just didn't feel right.
Right.
So if you just read the text of what their dreams contain in them, it doesn't sound necessarily like anything that caused them grief.
Right.
But it did.
It did.
Which means that there was a feeling, a sense of something that was occurring within the dream.
Yeah.
And it left them feeling ill at ease.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. And I want you to also notice that, and I guess I had never also noticed this, that the dreams that Joseph had initially were from God. God put these in his brain, and as he dreamed them, in fact, the two dreams that he had were given to him. Much like John was given his vision in Revelation, Joseph here is given these dreams. And then whenever he comes into contact with these two men, and I know this is something that we say, well, duh, of course, and we just kind of maybe overlook the fact that God went into the brain of these two Egyptian men that he was not their Elohim. They didn't see that at all, and yet he goes into their brain and provides these two dreams for them. Yeah.
I feel like back then they put more stock in
Yeah.
their word and believed that if you had a dream, because I mean we all dream and most of us don't remember when we wake up.
Yeah, yeah,
But if you had a dream, then it was a message from
yeah.
the gods.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And as I walk through some of this stuff, in other cultures, they as you say, they put a lot more stock into dreams. And I know many times, Terry and I, as we've talked about our dreams, not our dreams, but our, dreams. And you kind of walk through, well, I saw this and this happened and this went through, and so my brain puts them together. But there's no interpretation. There's just, there's just our brain processing things. But God offers these two men these dreams, and it affected them. They were both dejected or sad or whatever that might mean. And so Joseph notices this, and he asked them. And in fact, they must have some kind of relationship, because they're going to offer him the dream. We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them. Now, the last part of verse 8, and we looked at this a couple of weeks ago. What does Joseph then immediately say to these men? I got you. I can do this. This is kind of my thing. So tell me your dreams. In fact, what is he like? Now again, we don't have the full narrative here. And when I say that, I'm saying we don't have everything that happened. We have these highlights that have been written down for us. But what does he say to these men? My Elohim can.
God is able to interpret dreams.
Yeah.
It's not Joseph's ability.
Right.
But Joseph's God
Yes.
can help us out here.
Yes. Yes. And the more I read this, I'm just amazed that Joseph doesn't take any credit for this at all. In fact, even before it happens, do not interpretations belong to God. Give me a whack at it. And my Elohim. And I keep saying my Elohim because that's really blown my mind, because I've only known of Elohim in Genesis 1. Let us create God in our own image. And yet we find that this word is very general in terms of a God. So my Elohim, my God, he is able to interpret dreams. And so the chief cupbearer tells Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me And so with all of my curiosities, a vine, at least at this time, it represented growth, expansion, cooperation. It had a lot of these different ideas to it. And so there's this vine. And with this vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. Now, also notice that as we are reading through this, it's not only a dream given to Joseph, but as Joseph is listening to this, what is happening? Joseph's like, I got it. Joseph's not sitting there trembling. He's not scared. He's not like, can you give me like a day to process this? I need some time. He doesn't seem to do that. He goes right into, now, how would Joseph know not only what the dream is, but what it means, what its interpretation is? And the answer is kind of rhetorical. It's God gave it to him. God gave him the interpretation, like in the moment. Joseph is able to know what's happening here. Now, one of the challenges I think we have sometime in studying and reading through these stories is for many of us, how long have you been reading this story? And how many lessons and maybe books that you've read through? This is nothing new. You know what's about to happen. You know the interpretation of it. You know one's going to be elevated and one's going to have his head chopped off and impaled. You know what's coming. And so I think there's some really good lessons here and some things to pull out that sometimes we may overlook. It's like when you've watched a movie. Some of you may not be movie watchers. There's some movies that I probably watched, 40, 50 times. I just like it. I like the movie, and I like the flow of it and all that stuff. And as we've read through these things so many times, so as he's telling Joseph his dream, Joseph's got it. Now, how is he so confident in knowing the interpretation of this dream? How does he know? He seems to be sitting there just very confident. Verse 18, I think. Yeah, as the dream was said, what does Joseph say in verse 18? So here's your dream. Here we go. Let's do this. And he's right there. He's ready to go. God put the dream right in his head, the interpretation of it, and he's ready to do this. So in some ways, maybe that's the answer to our previous question is, how do we see the times that God has favor, that God is blessing us, even when situations in front of us are challenging or not perfect or are negative in our view? Is God blessing us when life goes bad? Is God's favor on us when things in front of us are challenging?
Yes, because he's not a God of partiality.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Maybe because sometimes we're being punished for things we do wrong.
Yeah. Bad decisions have bad outcomes.
So, bad outcome doesn't always mean that, God's with you through the bad times.
Right.
It's interesting to me that through this whole thing, we never see Joseph praying to God or taking knowledge of God, or the first time he mentions God is when he's interpreting dreams.
Yeah. True. And that's a real interesting kind of parallel because we don't see Joseph doing that. We see him acknowledging him, but there's no necessarily lifestyle of God. But when we get the story of Daniel, Daniel's praying, Daniel's showing faith, he's doing all kinds of things, and we don't necessarily see that. Not that it's not happening, we just don't have it in this narrative. with Joseph. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Well, before the Israelites were in the wilderness, they weren't given, there was no, how do I say, religion established, really.
Yeah, not till you get to Sinai. Yeah.
They didn't have the Ten Commandments.
Right.
They didn't have rituals. I always wondered how Abraham and Isaac and how they passed down the knowledge of God to their family, because it's not like they had an organized religion,
Right.
I guess.
Right. Well, you know, one of the things recently that I've at least been exposed to is for a lot of your ancient documents, whether they're, you know, of the biblical canon or not, is much like, let's say that you're going to read a 4-volume book set, and you get to volume 3 and you're reading through it. There's a lot of things that are written that they're assuming you read volume 1 and 2. They're not going to get into a lot of detail because you're supposed to know that. And with some of these things, there's things that the readers are supposed to know because it's already been availed to them in other situations. And we just don't know that stuff unless you're someone that academically really gets into those things. Does that make sense? And so God had to have given Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob some content in terms of how to please him and how to walk with him and those kind of things. But we don't get anything technical until you get to Sinai. You know? Yeah, Ty.
It's also just like the New Testament. Many books were written, they were written for specific occasions.
Yes.
Specific reasons. So Joseph having that relationship with God is necessary. You can see it from that. Whereas during the time of captivity, it was more important because they were punished for following God. And versus in Egypt, he probably could do whatever he wanted.
Yeah, yeah. And I like your first point because one of the podcasts I'm listening to that to me is very interesting, that it's very easy for us in our current way of thinking to go to a Bible book and to have an idea of what it's supposed to do for us, how it's supposed to communicate with us. And if we go to it in that vein, in that way, then there's either things that we might add or things we might miss because of how we're expecting that book to communicate to us. But to Ty's point, whether it's Old or New Testament, these books were written to a specific people for specific reasons at the cultural time they were written. But and a lot of the way we see that is in the New Testament. The fact that, you know, when Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he wasn't writing to the church at Ephesus, which had a different situation. He's writing to them about very specific issues that they were dealing with. You know, it's much like if you were gonna write a letter to someone about stuff you've learned at your job. Well, I'm not gonna find anything in there about fishing. Didn't they go fishing? Didn't they eat fish? I mean, why wouldn't they fish? Well, that's not the purpose of the letter. It's for something different. So I feel like I got a little weeds there from the comment that you originally made. But there's a lot of things that we're not given because it's not possibly pertinent to what's happening.
But at the same time, we do have some understanding of what was happening at this time in the time of Joseph and
Yeah.
Abraham and Isaac. And we know it was an oral tradition.
Yeah,
We know that
yeah,
they were
yeah.
handing down stories.
Yeah,
They were
yeah.
telling, they were talking about God. That's why when you get to Deuteronomy, that's why it becomes an instruction. Teach
Yeah.
this to your children.
Yeah.
Bind it on your foreheads. Talk about it when you're walking up. You know, all of these things were important because that's how this was
Yeah.
going to get communicated. That's
Yeah.
how this is going to get pushed through
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah.
Until eventually we do actually have more than the electronic word, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But theirs was an oral tradition.
Yeah.
They relied heavily upon the head of the family
Yeah.
to teach these things.
And you know, to that point, when that concept was like visualized in my brain, I got very aggravated because I'd never considered that you have, up until, I'm going to say his name wrong, the dude that made the printing press, Gutenberg, centuries before that, and especially for the Old Testament, they did not walk around with books and even anything written. It was all oral. And it wasn't oral because they didn't have anything else. That was their culture. They handed down stories and they taught things through oral methods. And especially as they, walked through the wilderness, and then centuries after that, that's how they told stories, that's how they gave guidelines. It was through, and of course, then when you get to Sinai, it's written on stone. And why is it written on stone? What's that? Permanence. Yeah. That's what they had. So, yeah, very much so. So I guess the point I'm making is that there are many, the way that we live and operate in life today, it's very easy for us to transcribe that onto the Bible. And of course they had books, and they did things the way we did them, the way we do them. And that's just simply not the case at all. So if we can possibly, think about how they lived and operated, there may be some things that we don't try and put in here, and we get out of it what was originally intended. I hope I didn't go way too in the weeds in there, and that was a big waste of 4 minutes, but that's been very interesting to me in terms of processing how the Bible was written and what its intent is for us. So looking at these men's dreams, again, the chief cupbearer has this vision about this vine. It blossoms, its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, put the cup in his hand. Joseph says this is what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to whenever you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, please remember me, show kindness to me, mention me to Pharaoh to get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put into at least the NIV says, into a dungeon. Maybe give us a little idea of what his life was like. What do the other translations say? What's that? Oh, that's it, yeah. Oh, into a pit. Okay. So have you ever, I don't know, as we go through these dreams, have you ever noticed how Joseph kind of fits in here? Whenever you get out, why would Joseph tell him whenever you get out and you are restored? Why would he tell him that? Because that's what the dream said. God gave him a dream, or God gave this man a dream. God gave Joseph the interpretation. And Joseph doesn't say, hey, if this dream works out, if this is actually what happens, he said, hey, whenever you get out, remember me. I guess I've never noticed the trust that he has in what God is telling him here. Whenever you get out, remember me. Mention me to Pharaoh. How interesting is that? And then in verse 15, he gives this little oral history to this cupbearer. How interesting is that? Just so you know, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here, I am being mistreated. I'm being put in this dungeon, and I don't deserve it. I've never noticed that before. And so when the chief baker, if you've never read this before, there's a little bit of humor here. So imagine the chief baker is watching this and he's listening. And as the dream is given, he's like, ooh, he got a good one. I like that. That's cool. I want to go next. Can I tell you mine? So when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he then says to Joseph, I had a dream too. And then he gives the dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds came and ate them out of the basket on my head. So imagine this chief baker is sitting there, and you know, sometimes with your kids, as they are anticipating, maybe they're asking you to go somewhere or do something, and they like got the keys in the hand, and they're just waiting to go, and you can see the anticipation. Of course, mom or dad's going to say yes, and then you're like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't like that. And the dejection or the frustration, whatever it may be. So imagine this chief baker is sitting there and he's waiting, you know, for this favorable interpretation. This is what your dream means. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and the baker's like, check, cool, you know, we're getting somewhere. Then 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh.
Can I have a refund?
Yeah, seriously. I was like, wait a minute. No. What's version 2? I don't like that one. That one's not cool. Why can't I be like the cupbearer?
As you read down through 20, 22, it seems like this is perfectly normal for the Pharaoh to say, oh yeah, nail this guy.
Yeah. Just like with the...
It's my birthday, stick him on stage.
Whack his head off, stick him on the stake. It's a normal day. It's a Tuesday.
Must be a relative of the Queen of Hearts.
What's that?
Relative of the Queen of Hearts.
Oh, yes. so,
I mean, you do see something similar in the New Testament too, with Herod and
yeah,
his
yeah,
wife.
yeah,
John the Baptist had.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Seems to be a common theme.
Right. And you're almost like, if you were to question it, like, what? This is a Thursday. It's normal.
But I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, you know, I do think that there's something else happening here behind the scenes that is more logical.
Yeah,
Which is simply that there were these 2 men thrown in prison for some reason.
yeah,
One of them was taken back out of prison and allowed to resume his role, and the other one was not.
yeah,
So, you know, they have theorized that it was probably an assassination attempt. In fact,
Yeah.
recordings of in some of the favorites of an event like this happening where
Yeah.
you know, there was an assassination attempt on his life.
Right.
So maybe during this time they were in prison, they were investigating. trying to
Yes,
figure
yes,
out
yes.
what happened.
yes.
And then, oh, by the way, the baker did it.
The baker did it. Yeah,
But a candlestick.
yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. And so if that is the case, how interesting it is that you have this secular situation going on while in the dungeon, this other situation is happening where God is operating. God is working through these dreams. And none of the players, none of the participants have any idea what's happening on either side. And yet, who is aware of both? Is Elohim. God is involved in both.
But it's all for a purpose.
And it's all for a purpose.
We know what God's intention is. In fact, when Joseph says, remember me, I'm not so sure he's giving him a command. I mean, he is. He wants him to remember him, but
Right.
it's almost more of a prophecy.
Yeah.
Because eventually, the cupbearer does remember him.
Yeah.
That's what restores Joseph and
Yeah.
puts him in a position of prominence.
Yeah.
Again, all God's design.
Yeah.
I still think it's funny that it took him a year to remember him. It's
2 years.
It was two years. Yeah. Yeah.
3 days and you were out. How did you forget in that short time? Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
You know, I know a guy. Had this dream. It's freaking me out. You know, I know a guy. What was his name? Yeah.
I made a curious note from the Bible about fruit of the vine and bread. The same story.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. 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 Well, and I tried to find some symbolism in terms of Egyptology and all of these things, and I couldn't find anything because Doug piqued my interest in kind of, there's got to be more to it than just, and then when you look at the interpretations of it, they don't seem to be all that. It's like, Andy, you're trying too hard here. Just take it for what it is, and and move on.
I think it also bears mention on Joseph's part. What he had to tell that fella was
Yeah,
hard.
good point.
That was a hard truth that he had to tell,
Yeah,
but he still told the truth.
Yeah.
He didn't try to candy coat it.
Right.
He didn't do it in a hateful way. He didn't do it. He just told the truth.
Yeah.
So many times today, it's hard for us to, if we know it, to just speak truth.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
Joseph, that's what the dream meant.
Yeah.
That's what he said, and he didn't do it in a spiteful way at all. He just told the truth for what it was.
yeah, yeah. And to that point, it's also interesting that, at least in the narrative, the good is first and the bad is next, as opposed to, the bad is first and the cupbearer is like, I don't know if I want to tell you mine, because I might die too. But the good one is first, the bad one is next, and so, it ends with a little more foreboding kind of a situation. And so to close out the chapter, the third day was the Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. Again, I may be trying too hard here, but this feast he gave to all the officials, in that feast, who was there? It was the cupbearer and the baker. So somehow they were taken out of this dungeon and placed with this feast. They were there. And again, as we read through Bible things that we've read a gazillion times, sometimes these little tiny details, how did they get there? Did he just say, hey, I'm having a feast, so call them up, and once the feast is over, I'll put them back in the dungeon?
And now Jesus summoned his chief cupbearer, chief baker, to join the other officials.
Yeah. Yeah, so brings them out and then what Joseph said happens. So you have to wonder also, the narrative here tells us that the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. But as Joseph hears about what happens, exactly the dreams that God gave them, the interpretation God gave Joseph, worked out. They came true to the dot on the I. And so I would assume that built his faith, built his trust, and God just continued to give him favor. But where was his favor? Where was he when this favor was ongoing? I think this is really important for us. Where was Joseph physically as God continues to have favor on him? He's in a dungeon. He's in prison. So he's not gotten out. It's not like a week or 2 weeks later he's out. So, he goes from being sold. Is God's favor on him when he's sold? Yes. And then he gets into Potiphar's house, and all of these events occur. Is God's favor on him when he's in Potiphar's house? Yes. And then he's a man of integrity with Potiphar's wife, ends up being thrown in this dungeon. Is God's favor with him in this dungeon? And it is. So what great lessons for us that whenever life in front of us doesn't go like we want it to, like we have planned, is God's favor with us? And it is. It always is with us. It just doesn't look like we may want it to in our life. All right, we'll continue there and keep looking at dreams next week. Let's close with a prayer. Loving God, we thank you. We love you. We pray that we would rewire and re-engineer our brains to know that your favor is always with us, even when things don't look like we want them to and don't go the way we want them to. We pray that you would help us and anoint us with your wisdom and enlightenment in this way. Pray this in the great name of Jesus. Amen.